Very cool. Well, thank you, and good morning from where I am, and where greetings for whatever time of day it is in your part of the world. This has taken a while to get together. Lauren got in touch with me a few months ago and said, "Would you be prepared to present for one of these?" And my first response was, "That's 3:30 in the morning. Let's wait until we've had the change of daylight saving and we can at least get it till 5:30 in the morning, and that will feel a little bit more human than 3:30 in the morning." So thank you for your patience with the continuance of the invitation, and it's good to be with you a few months later. So my name's Nathan. I work at the Science Publishing Company, which is the Adventist denominational publishing house in the South Pacific Division, based just outside of Melbourne, in the south of Australia. We're just heading into summer, of course, in our part of the world, and that's always a better time of year because it can get pretty cold here. Perhaps not compared to some places that some of you are from, but nonetheless, we get snow within reasonable distance of here regularly across winter, and so heading into spring, we've got all those good things happening in our part of the world. So the topic of race and racism, as I mentioned, or as was mentioned, pretty much exactly a year ago, I was part of a team that put out a book entitled A House on Fire, co-edited with Professor Maury Jackson from La Sierra University, and collecting 20 chapters from Adventist scholars, writers, activists from around the world. We have representatives in that book from every inhabited continent, and a fascinating collection of people writing on what we believe is a really important topic. When I present some of these ideas in person, one of the things that I often begin with is to ask a question, and the way I've done it in the past has been to ask people in a room to stand and then to sit when we get to an answer that they're comfortable with. But in this format, I want to try experiment with it in a different way, and just to those of you who want to participate, to throw up some suggestions of numbers in the chat, and we'll see what we can come up with. But the question that I have for you, and it kind of an experiment just to see where we're all at, as a percentage of the population of the world, how many would we consider white? So we have about 8 billion people in the world, and I guess using the strange kind of thing that we look at of Caucasian. So how many people, what percentage of the 8 billion people in the world would we consider that are white people? If you want to just throw up a suggestion in the chat, I've seen a couple already, 15%, 18%. It's an auction. Can I get more than 12%? Okay, going the other direction, 12, 10. Okay, that's interesting. It's interesting that in different groups where I've presented that, I get different numbers. We've got a 20, couple of 20s, a 25. Any further contributions? What percentage of the world's 8 billion approximate people? We've got a 30%. Nobody's got it right yet. Okay, 10, less than 15. 8%. Well, that's the closest we've got so far. So the answer as it's collected, somebody else said less than 15%. That's technically right. So 8% is the closest we've got. As people guess it, and of course these things are estimates, there's about 700 million Caucasians in a world of 8 billion people. So about 8.75%. So Patty, you've got closest there. One of the questions I think is to reflect on that is firstly why almost in every group that I've been in, almost everybody, I think 8% is the first time anybody's actually got lower than the number. And the reality is that most people are somewhere in the 50, maybe 15 to 25% is the band in which most people would guess it at. So one of the things we recognize there is that firstly, that we overestimate how many white people are in the world. And I think there's a number of reasons why we do that. One of the first them being that simply it's the way we see the world, and most of the groups that I've shared this with are in dominant white populations. And so that's the experience we have of the world. When we live in some nations more than others, or some regions more than others, we see a lot more white people and we don't see a lot of the other world. Of course, it's partly also a complex combination of many different factors: history, economics, media, so many of the voices that we listen to. But why is it that there's this group of people that are so powerful, wealthy, and historically dominant when they are technically such a small part of the population? And I would suggest that there's one more really important reason, and that's theology. And I'll just throw up my screen and get that underway. And I guess that's really the heart of what I would say that the book is about, and that I guess what I want to share with you today is simply that I see that the reason that our world is so out of whack, when we talk about race and racism, is theology. And that's an interesting thing for us to reflect upon. In her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, Ellison Barr makes this comment: the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing Christians that oppression is godly, that God ordained some people, split their sex or skin color or both, as belonging under the power of other people. And this is something that I came to, this kind of recognition, recognizing, I guess, this as a very significant aspect of the world, is something that I came across in the course of a master's program that I did across the middle of the 20-teens in a small Christian college in Bend, Oregon, of all places. And I have long had this interest in my writing, and I guess in my work and activism, if we want to use that kind of language, in the challenge of injustice in the world. The Bible's call to do justice is such a dominant theme in the Bible and I had my own experience that I would describe as my conversion, having grown up, as a pastor's kid, always going to church, my whole life, always believing in God. That perhaps one of my most significant conversion experiences was recognizing this call to do justice that is such a dominant theme in the Bible. And so I did a master's program almost 7 or 8 years ago now, over a couple of years, had some opportunities to study with some leading, particularly Black Christian leaders in the US, who are talking about some of their experiences and some of the challenges and injustices that they confront. It seemed to me that as I was studying this Masters of Theology and Justice, that every time I would turn over a rock of injustice, I would find underneath it racism as kind of the operating system of injustice, in the reason that we got injustice to be perpetuated in the world. That it's basically this underlying thing that other people are not as important as me, and that's a challenge, and I think something that we have a real meaningful response to. So a couple of caveats before I get into it. Firstly, as might be obvious, I'm one of those 8.75% white guys in the world, and that's where I come from when confronting this. I have little direct experience of race and racism. As I've mentioned, I've had some opportunities to study it, but I do believe that race and racism is a white people problem. And it just happens to be the one that many of us seem to benefit from, even as all of us are undiminished and endangered by it. And so I really think that what we need to listen to the experiences of others and particularly those who most keenly feel the injustices of racism in our world. We need to listen to their stories. We need to listen to their voices. We also, as white people, need to take responsibility for this and do some of the hard work ourselves in confronting and asking some of these hard questions of ourselves and of each other. Because it is one of the most pernicious aspects of white privilege that we get to have to think about race and racism. I was talking to a friend this week and he said, so many people don't understand what I need to do to prepare to step out into the world for the day. And he was talking about his daily experiences of, how people react to him as a black man here in Australia. My race is not something I'm forced to factor in to my everyday life and the plans I make for it. That Christians are not raising louder voices against the tide of racism in our societies also demonstrates our theological blind spots. As James Cone put it, what is invisible to white Christians and their theologians is inescapable to black people. And as we'll discuss, if we actually believe in creation, in God making human beings in his image and incarnation, God identifying as one of the poor, the refugee, the oppressed, the murdered, and making a way of salvation for all people, we must listen, learn, and speak, or we risk losing our faith in a meaningful sense. I guess I also come at this as an Australian, and so I guess ask your forgiveness for those toes I might inadvertently step on. I think I'll step on a few intentionally, but chances are I'll also inadvertently stand on some. But as an Australian talking about this topic, I'm not coming at it from some, like my joking comment earlier, we haven't solved racism in Australia. Recently, Australia held a referendum to ask the question of whether we would recognise our Indigenous peoples in the Constitution of Australia. And the outcome of that referendum was a really blunt and harsh no. And that, for many of us, was quite a jarring result. Not only is Australia the only developed Western nation with a colonial past that does not recognise its Indigenous people in some official sense, it is now the only nation in the world that has once had the opportunity and taken that step of going to that and being asked to do that, has actually turned around and said no. So we have sort of doubled down on our colonial racism and the damage that we have done there in the past. So Australia is a country that is seriously, must confront its own racist history, heritage, and modern reality. And that has been the past few months, as the public debates have swirled around that referendum, has been a really revelatory time for those of us who are concerned about these issues. Another caveat, this is a huge topic, and we're not going to solve racism in the next couple of hours, so apologies for that. But the questions that our culture and society are asking are important, and I think that they are important as far as how we, I'm just trying to move this forward. Here we go. These questions that come to us from the society around us are an invitation to engage in an apologetic that is more concerned with gentleness and respect than merely giving an answer. Montagnais says they are an indication that Christian apologetics must shift its approach from having all the answers to being present in the questions. And I think this is one of the interesting experiences that I've had in the year that the book A House on Fire has been released, is simply how people have responded to this as saying, this is a topic, this is an issue, this is a place in which your faith can actually contribute something meaningful to society, and people are interested in it in a different kind of way than they might be if I was to simply share what we might consider a more traditional sharing literature. That this is something that is actually giving a meaningful answer from the best of our faith tradition to a really important issue in our world. And I think the final caveat that I'll give before we jump into it fully, and this is a difficult and fraught kind of topic, is that this should be confronting. Our discussions about race and racism should be something that make us feel uncomfortable at times, that challenge the ways we look at the world and how we do or don't listen to each other and how we value others around us. So I think this is a significant thing for us to spend some time on. So often when we start talking about justice, we instead start talking about injustice. After all, it's often the injustice that catches our attention, whether a horrific headline, a political outrage, an unfolding disaster, or a chronic problem such as poverty or inequality, violence or environmental degradation or economic exploitation. These are the things that make up the headlines. And so these are the things that catch our attention. But that's not where the Bible's many calls to justice begin. Instead, the Bible story opens with a world created good for human beings created in the image of God. And of course, theologians and philosophers have long debated what specifically we mean when we talk about human beings being created in the image of God. But in most tradition, it's something that is insisted on in most traditions in Christian history, as well as the world's other monotheistic religions. And this has been a foundational tenet of what it means to be human and key to our ethical responsibility for how we act towards our fellow human beings. What is appreciated and practiced less often is how socially transformative, economically disruptive, and politically challenging such an understanding of our human origins and values ought to be. If we as Adventists claim ourselves as creationists, we should be really alert to the ethical and political implications of that. Writing in the Washington Post a few years ago, a columnist, Michael Gerson, highlighted the tensions in history between how faith has been used to diminish and to ennoble, to oppress and to liberate, to hurt and to help, but also how essential and politically inconvenient is this core formulation of human identity. He wrote, "Christianity inevitably raises this question. What if everyone we favor and everyone we fear and everyone we help, everyone we exploit, everyone we love, and everyone we hate were the reflected image of God, unique, valuable, and destined for eternity?" To insist that all people are created in the image of God has this dramatic political and practical implication. If we believe this foundational teaching of our faith in any meaningful way, much of what currently passes for political debate is simply unacceptable and unsustainable. And of course, we have a natural affinity for our family, our friends, and even community members, as we should. That is a part of who we are. But we must also and always resist the temptation of assuming that others beyond our circles are of lesser value as human beings. And really, I think we could use that as a kind of working definition for racism in this time we spend together. That of assigning lesser value to those who are different or even that merely look different from us. I think that then taking that a step further and saying we do that in systemic ways. As commentators such as Ta-Nehisi Coates have pointed out, race is primarily an invention of racism. There is no biological or other scientific basis for identifying race, and the concept as we know it is largely a creation of our modern world. While the Bible describes rivalries between families, tribes, and peoples, these are more focused on cultures, languages, and the gods than they are on physical appearance. And one that doesn't even need to go as far back as the Bible. And that's, I guess, firstly, one reason why I don't have a lot of Bible verses to share in this presentation, because the Bible doesn't say much about racism as we know it in the modern world, other than the insistence on the value and uniqueness of each individual. But we don't even have to go as far back as the Bible. We can go back to the plays of Shakespeare as just one cultural artifact and look at how people of what we would now describe as different races are treated without that kind of political import of their difference. And so that's an interesting study. In his remarkable and landmark book, The Christian Imagination, Willie James Jennings describes racism as a revolt against creation. And that's something that should catch our attention as creationists. It is startling to realize that racism, as we know it in the modern world, is a theological issue, a rejection of our belief in creation and creationism. Our theology is one of our burdens, and it is one of our potential resources. The historical reality is that racism and race as we know them in the modern world developed significantly in the 15th and 16th century as the theological rationale for the burgeoning European expansion, exploration, and colonization of the world. The physical differences of the inhabitants of the colonized lands became the practical shorthand for implementing a theological decree issued by Pope Nicholas V, the papal bull Dum Diversus of June 18, 1452, which gave the King of Portugal permission to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, in the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his use and their use, and profit. This was one of the foundational documents of what became known as the doctrine of discovery. There were a couple of other papal decrees later in the 15th century, particularly one of a significant date of 1493, Columbus's return from the supposed New World that he had supposedly discovered, and that they were then given this kind of theological imprimatur that this was something they could go forth and exploit, both the lands and the peoples. Basically, wherever there were people who weren't Christian, they were subject to this kind of exploitation. It became the theological cover for the colonization of the European powers that went on to cover in the following centuries about 85% of the world's landmass, with slavery, discrimination, systemic disadvantage and disparity, and so much more in the centuries since. Unfortunately, this innovation of late medieval Christianity received less attention in the great Reformation movements over the following centuries and remains a largely unfinished, perhaps barely commenced work of Christian Reformation. Although I do need to note a couple of significant developments this year. Firstly, that the Vatican in March this year officially renounced the doctrine of discovery, and which is an interesting thing that didn't get a lot of headlines at the time. And a little closer to home, I also note with some real enthusiasm the statement that was voted by the North American Division's year-end meetings just a couple of weeks ago, where they also repudiated the doctrine of discovery. So this is current Reformation work that we were invited to engage with and be part of. As we've already noted, our foundational understanding of what it means to be human is that all people are created in God's image, as Genesis tells us, that they are loved, John 3:16, and invited, Revelation 14:6, by God. So every person is covered by at least those three attributes of God's attitude towards each human being. This ought to be particularly so in the context of the fellowship and work of the church. As one of our fundamental beliefs puts it, that distinctions of race, culture, learning, and nationality, and differences between high and low, rich and poor, male and female, must not be divisive among us. We are all equal in Christ, who by one Spirit has bonded us into one fellowship with him and with one another. We are to serve and to be served without partiality or reservation. And if that is the attitude within the church, which to some degree this fundamental belief is focused upon, I think it should also be the attitudes that we serve outside and beyond the walls of the church as well. So I get back to this assertion, my core assertion, that this is a theological issue with real world implications. And I believe that the theological aspect of race should be a cause for our shame and reflection, but also a cause for hope and engagement. Jamar Tisby, in his book, The Color of Compromise, described how in the early days of American Christianity, there was an impulse to evangelize and baptize the enslaved peoples. And that's was a, I guess we would think, a worthy thing, but it kind of put them in a bind, because there were particularly some of those who were slave holders were concerned that if we were to baptize these enslaved peoples, that what would that do to their status as enslaved? And so in what we might consider today a pretty outrageous kind of imposition upon what it means to be baptized, they actually, as a compromise, put into the baptismal vows the acknowledgement that baptism would not materially change their enslaved status. It's remarkable, the collusion between Christianity and the book, The Color of Compromise, has many such examples. Martin Luther King Jr., in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, puts it like this: the greatest blasphemy of the whole ugly process was that the white man ended up making God his partner in the exploitation of the Negro. What greater heresy has religion known? Ethical Christianity vanished and the mere moral nerve of religion was atrophied. This terrible distortion sullied the essential nature of Christianity. Writing in the context of racial prejudice, and as one who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel argued that such prejudice is a kind of a treacherous denial of the existence of God. In other words, prejudice negates any pretense of trying to believe in a God who claims to have made all people in his image. Herschel continues, any God who is mine but not yours, any God concerned with me but not with you, is an idol. Faith in God is not simply an afterlife insurance policy. Or religious bigotry must be recognized for what it is: Satanism, blasphemy. Prayer and prejudice cannot dwell in the same heart. Worship without compassion is worse than self-deception. It is an abomination. When stated in such blunt terms, the theological and moral urgency of the task of combating and overcoming racism cannot be ignored. It is as big and complicated as how we act and react politically and in our communities, and how our church and its programs are structured, led, and are accessible and welcoming to all or not. It's as difficult and awkward as how we learn to learn to listen better to people who are different, and how we respond to that racist joke or social media post a friend makes. And this is where we get to, I guess, to the term that has been used popularly in the last few years of anti-racism, because racism is embedded so deeply in our minds, our culture, our systems. It is not enough to merely be not racist. Instead, we must be consciously and actively working to be anti-racist, to be intentional about undoing racism. And here there is yet more theological work to be done. The assumptions of 550 years of theological history are not easily untangled and undone. And as good as the statement from the North American Division is, for example, a statement is a starting point, not an end point. We have followed much of the dominant Christian world in reading the Bible as a white and Western text. We perpetuate the doctrine of discovery in some of our standard interpretations of Bible prophecy, and we maintain a prophetic focus that ignores much of the world, its people, and its history. We privilege music, language, and art from a European heritage as somehow holier than other cultural expressions. We have grown our missionary and evangelistic reach on the wings of American empire across the 20th century, but we can do theology. And this is where perhaps this recognition of the interplay between racism and theology gives us some hope. Theology is a field that we have some understanding of and some opportunity for, and there's really not much more Adventist than trying to come up with better theology as a rebuttal to historically bad theology. This is a project, I think, that Adventists should get excited about. A better theology and a better expression of our theology will launch us into the world around us with more to contribute to the necessary theological and systemic work of undoing racism. Perhaps this was hinted at in the words of then General Conference President A.G. Daniels when he was summarising the part of the life work of Ellen White at her funeral as part of the eulogy he gave in 1915. This was part of his summary of Ellen White's work, that slavery, the caste system, unjust racial prejudices, the oppression of the poor, the neglect of the unfortunate, these are all set forth in her writings and in her work as unchristian and a serious menace to the well-being of the human race, and as evils which the Church of Christ is appointed by her Lord to overthrow. This is the language of revolution and of reformation. And I think that's the kind of marching orders we should have in the world today. And in this regard, perhaps one of the most revolutionary and most faithful assertions that we can make is simply this: it doesn't have to be this way. We human beings made this stuff up, historically, and of course over centuries, but it also means we can change it. Again, it might take centuries, but while it is deeply entrenched, it has become that way because of a series of decisions made in the past, some of which continue to be made today. So we can begin to choose differently. It doesn't have to be this way. Yeah, it's been observed many times that the winners most often write the history as one of the ways by which the powerful tend to defend the status quo. But too often they also they write the theology. And without great care and much prayer, theology too easily morphs into or is co-opted towards a justification of the world as it is, and the inevitability of the divides between black and white, the poor and the powerful, and their many injustices and outrages. Even in our own Adventist community, there are examples of this, and one that I think is particularly telling is that the Sabbath School Quarterly, we probably see that as one of the, at least worldwide, one of the ongoing expressions of our collective theology, or at least of teaching theology in many parts of the world. Across the history of the Adventist Church, we have produced about 150 Sabbath School Quarterlies. Of those, only 10 have been written by Black people, and of those, all of them were men, and all of them based in North America. I think we're missing some voices as far as those that we are listening to. The faithful and prophetic voices reject the assumptions of the inevitability of one particular way of seeing the world. Our vision of God and his kingdom always offers an alternative reality. Neither our ultimate confidence nor our greatest fear are invested in the powerful, the political, or the economic structures, or the status quo that our society urges us to accept. The actions of God as we see them recorded in history have not been inevitable. Rather, they have always been disruptive, counterintuitive, and a real threat to those in power. In the first Christmas carol, the first song that was sung to celebrate the birth of Jesus, Mary, in her Magnificat, made this point. As unlikely as it was for her and Elizabeth, two Hebrew peasants effectively, to be singing about what their boys were going to do in the world, this was part of her song. God's mighty arm has done tremendous things. He has scattered the proud and the haughty ones. He has brought down princes from their thrones and exalted the humble. Observing God's revolutionary act should give us pause. It will challenge and reshape our understanding of God. But of course, that's an important thing. James Cone put it like this: if God had chosen as his holy nation the Egyptian slave masters instead of the Israelite slaves, a completely different kind of God would have been revealed. This is one of those statements that I can sit and think about for a long time, because it's one of those things that we discover God by God's acts in history, and God has been particular. God has chosen a side in history. He loves all people, but he also chooses sides, in particularly when there are the weak and the vulnerable. Not only was this an Old Testament thing, it was also the story we see of Jesus and his incarnation. In Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman methodically works through making the case that Jesus was a Jew, a poor Jew, and a poor Jew living in an occupied territory, a territory occupied by a colonial power. And he goes through that none of that was accidental. That was God identifying with the oppressed, with the least of these. And ultimately, this is what Jesus did in his crucifixion. In Cone's last and perhaps most significant book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he traces out how the experience and the observations that we see in the horrendous outrages of lynching was something that can help us understand the brutality of the unjust murder of Jesus. And that in turn transforms how we see the phenomenon of lynching and of racial violence in our world today. I believe that the cross placed alongside the lynching tree can help us see Jesus in America in a new light, and thereby empower people who claim to follow him to take a stand against white supremacy and every kind of injustice. Because Jesus identified with those who are the victims of our world, this will shape our understanding of ourselves, of our God, and of others. It is sobering to hear the voices of the Hebrew and contemporary prophets and recognize the ways in which we might be on the receiving end of their warnings and rebukes. All we have to do sometime is spend some time reading one of the Hebrew prophets without assuming that we're the good guys in the story. While we might be tempted to applaud as the prophet critiques those who we don't agree with or don't like, the louder we, the sooner the prophet's focus will turn to us. And this is where there are big questions to answer. The world did not and does not have to be as it is. The rejection of inevitability should free our imagination. Guided by the glimpses we see of God in the Bible and in our world, we can imagine a different world and reach out to people that some in our society tell us that we ought to be afraid of. And I think that there are some significant implications for this, for who we are as a church, how we undertake the work of ministering to our communities. And so I came up with some things here that I think that we are worth us thinking about as we try and get practical with this. We need to spend the time learning about these issues. We need to do the work. We need to do some of the reading, and I can give you a recommended reading list pretty quickly if some of these things that I've referenced are something that you aren't familiar with. I'm sure many of you are, but if they're new, then I recommend spending some time exploring some of these big ideas and these important issues. We also need to educate our church on these issues. I've been surprised, even in some of the work that I've done in the context of our discussion here in Australia in the lead up to the referendum that I referenced earlier, that my church, my local church, and some other places, we conducted some public events that we invited church members to be a part of, and how some of the things that we were sharing, some of even the material that I've shared here, is new to people, and we need to be doing the work to actually educate our church members about this. One of the responses that I've had, and even enthusiastically sharing the statement from the North American division regarding the doctrine of discovery from church leaders in this part of the world, is, what's the doctrine of discovery and why should we be concerned about that? And of course, that's an opportunity to answer those questions and have those conversations. But that's also something that we should be called to be more intentionally focused on. There's some research that's been conducted by one of our institutions that will be released, I think, early in the new year, that talked about topics for that Adventist pastors consider that they should be preaching about. And frustratingly, from my perspective, justice and poverty is at the bottom of that list. It's not considered a priority by far too many people in our church. And that's something we really need to do some work on. We need to minister holistically, and there's one of the chapters that really caught my imagination in A House on Fire is written by Dr. Marlene Ferreras from La Sierra University, where she talks about the implications of living in a racialized world for ministry, and that we can't minister to people. It's part of our Adventist holism that we can't minister to people effectively while ignoring the different experiences they have in the world, often because of their appearance or because of their skin color or whatever that might be. We have to be alert to that. We have to be sensitive to that in meaningful ministry. And so we need to recognize the differences. For me, one of the revelatory experiences was when I got married a number of years ago, and was suddenly living, having grown up without sisters, only a brother, suddenly to be sharing life and a house with a young lady, and just her experiences of stepping out into the world and how they were different from mine. As a tall white guy, I very rarely considered issues of safety or issues of some of those basic things that for other people to simply step out into the world around us is something that requires much more thought and much more, and I think just to know that even just the two of us that had so much in common, that had such different experiences of what it meant to do simple things in everyday life. We need to be open to hearing those stories and to recognizing the different experiences of people in our world. And then my final point here is we need to learn to be political. Now, you'll notice I didn't say we need to be political, because we are. So many things that we do in our everyday lives and even in our more intentional lives are political. But we need to learn to do that more intentionally and with greater thought. Our church, has this kind of thing saying we are not political, but the reality is that we are. It simply is that we do it when it suits us. And there was a fascinating experience, again, I refer to the recent experiences here in Australia with the referendum. Some of our church leaders here in Australia were meeting with some politicians on some what we would describe as religious liberty issues. And after they'd made their presentations and had their conversations, the politician then turned to them and said, "So where are you guys on what we're trying to do good in society? Why do you only turn up and talk to us when you want something for yourselves?" And I was when I heard that story, I was going, "Oh wow, that's quite a significant critique from one of Australia's political, elected representatives about how our church is political." And the reality is we just often don't do it particularly well. I've used the analogy of it's a little bit like how we talk about Adventists not dancing. We don't dance. So when we turn up at our cousin's wedding and in the enthusiasm of the moment we get dragged out to do that, we do it really badly because we've never learned how to do it properly. And we do the same with being political. We don't do politics. So when we do, inevitably, we do it badly. And so we need to be more intentional about learning how to do these things well. And I think that's something for us as individuals and also as a church that we need to give more attention to. So it comes down to who we are as followers of Jesus, as people of God in our world today. And I believe we will be people who begin to hear the voices and the stories of those whose voices and stories are not usually heard. Joining with God, our preference will always be for the least of these, giving ear and amplification, as Matthew 12 put it, to the weakest reed and the flickering candle. We honor the humble and welcome the stranger, challenging prejudice and building diverse communities, seeking justice and creating beauty in both obvious and unlikely ways and places. In all of this, we join with God in his mission of disruption and rejection of the inevitable. And we do this not in diminishing or disregarding the faith we claim, but precisely because of our faith and its distinctive insights. One of my favorite quotes comes from Chuck Scriven and was quoted in The Silent Church by Dr. Plantak. What is desperately needed are people who speak distinctively and movingly from within Adventism to the larger community. Voices who, from the core of Adventist particularity, express a universal message for our time. People who allow the power of the gospel to challenge those who oppress the vulnerable. Our discernment of God must have sociological implications. It is universal and personal, and it urges our freedom to choose, but insists that we choose well. It seeks to reshape societies and remodel economies, to rebuild communities and renovate lives. It demands the best of our human imagination, creativity, and problem solving. It requires effort and energy. It culminates in the ultimate disruption and discontinuity of the second coming. But because of this hope, it begins today in ourselves, our church, and our communities. Whenever we choose love over fear, courage over safety, generosity over consumerism, humanity over tribalism and nationalism, thoughtfulness over assumptions, welcome over prejudice, anti-racism over the systemic injustices of the status quo, others over ourselves, the prophetic over the inevitable. A comment on social media was dismissive of an article that I wrote last year on some of the aspects of this issue. The comments went something like, "We can't expect racism to be fixed anytime this side of the kingdom." To which I replied, "The hope that you have expressed, that racism will be undone when the kingdom of God comes in its fullness, is precisely why we can and must work to undo racism now." I want to finish with one of my favorite chapters out of A House on Fire, and it's written by Dr. Kendra Valentine, talking about this verse in Revelation 7, but also reflecting on our call to present truth. She writes this: early Adventists sacrificed comfort, social acceptability, and even family to share their present truth. Taking on carriages and trains to camp meetings, they took the truth their studying had uncovered. After investigating present truth, they acted on it, inviting others to join them and joining with others who were already taking necessary action. When I go to one of my favorite scenes in scripture, I cannot help but think of the television images of vast crowds in our town squares and our parks in the summer of 2020. After this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. I've been reminded of this vision described by the writer of the Apocalypse when I have seen images of people of all backgrounds and ages walking in cities around the world, non-violently calling for policies of equality and justice for all. They are calling out for the arrival of the future, wanting to live in a world in the way the last book of Scripture envisions it, where mourning and crying and pain are no more, where chokeholds are no more, where everyone breathes free. So let it be.
Oh, thank you very much, Nathan. You've been getting a lot of reaction from people who have been discussing this and interacting. By the way, I see Maury Jackson is here. Maury, would you join this conversation right now? Since you're on, if you are, I'd be welcome. We'd welcome to have you.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Nathan. Thank you, wonderful, and thank you to Lauren.
It was a great presentation, and thank you for being here, Maury. Several people have made this point here. This last quote from Chuck Scriven hit me pretty hard. What is desperately needed are people who speak distinctively and movingly from within Adventism to the larger community. Ed Reifsnyder made a little comment here, and he expressed what I'm thinking. He said, unless we're telling them about the three angels, we really don't want to talk to them too much about anything else. And I think he makes a good point. I don't think we are people who like joining the larger conversation very well. And I'm not quite sure why, Nathan, whether we're a little frightened of it, whether we feel we don't have anything to say, as Ed said, other than our thoughts about prophecy. I'm just not sure. I'm going to ask Horace to start out here for us, and I'll ask you to unmute. And Horace, speak to us.
Lauren. Thank you, Nathan, for that quite objective and sensitive treatment of this topic. I really appreciate your presentation today. On a very basic level, I believe racism is a human thing, not necessarily a religiously oriented phenomenon. I was Dean of Instruction at a community college here in California, a college which had been primarily serving a Caucasian community. And when the demographics shifted to the African-American community, that's when I became Dean of Instruction of this particular institution. And while there, my president tried to use me as an instrument to oppress the next minority, which was a Latino minority, which was becoming prominent in the demographic served by that community college. And it reminded me of how human racism is. Someone said, watch a minority become a majority, seize authority, oppress a minority. So sometimes in the process of overcoming a societal evil, we ourselves become transformed into that which we're trying to change. And so it doesn't, we really haven't made any progress as a human race. But then there's the theological argument which you made, which I think is very valid as well. And I think it begins with Israel having the audacity to consider itself God's special chosen people. Because if you're the chosen, it means all the others are the unchosen, which means we are better than they in some way, or we're more special than they in some way. And of course, this is carried throughout the history of the Old Testament. And then when it comes to modern America, where we have the doctrine of manifest destiny, we have the same kind of mindset where we are here to subjugate the others and we're here to exploit the resources that are available. And then that translates into modern Adventism, where we are supposedly the remnant. We are the last remaining true people of God. And so I think all of this it's a long legacy that we're dealing with here. But God does address this issue. Back in Numbers chapter 12, we see Miriam and Aaron criticizing Moses. And they say, does God speak only through Moses? Doesn't he speak through other people? But the Bible makes it clear that the reason they were trying to criticize their brother was because he married an Ethiopian woman. And God reprimanded them, and God cursed Miriam with leprosy so that they had to stop the whole camp of Israel in one spot until her period of quarantine was over, and then they could move on their travel to the promised land. This goes to show you that racism retards the progress of any organization. But yeah, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, Dathan, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Thank you for your comment. I do think that there are different meanings and nuances when we start using the different language here. And I would sort of make a distinction between what we could talk about as interpersonal prejudice compared to systemic racism. And I guess so. The focus of what I was presenting was kind of a more recent innovation, but that was readily built upon the personal prejudices that many of us had. But of course, the other thing that we find ourselves in the world today is that we're often interacting more with people who are different, whether that's through media, online, or personally, than perhaps the tribes of ancient Israel did, which often were largely self-contained communities that were defending themselves against, people that were trying to attack them or whatever. But I would even point us back to that in the biblical record, the chosenness of Israel at its best was actually for the benefit of others. And so we need to not rush too quickly to criticize the exclusivity of that. I would even, and there's been a comment there about, remnantism exclusionary. At its best, remnant is a call to serve. And I think that that's where we should be careful in calling ourselves remnant, because that's probably a pretty daunting kind of calling if we take it seriously. Whereas if we want to claim it as some kind of badge of honor, then we've probably missed the point. So I do think that we need to be careful, or we need to, because of the complexity of the issues that we're talking about, we do need to look at some of the different ways we could describe this. But I take your point, and I think that it's a useful contribution. So thank you.
Horace, can I follow up on your comment? Give me a little example of how that worked. How you found, if you can, it may not be something you can talk about, but how you found your administration trying to pit minorities against each other.
I was among my responsibilities was to approve the use of the college facilities, and my president, who happened to be African American, called me into his office and said, when these Latinos come with you with a request for use of facilities, I want you to block it. I don't want it to come to my desk. You must stop it at your desk. And I said, what is the basis for my doing this? Because we are a community college, and we are here to serve the community, regardless of who is in that community or what the dominant ethnic group might be. So what is the basis? And he couldn't, of course, give me an answer. And to cut a long story short, I didn't last very long in that administration.
The reason this struck me when you said this was because I've always bristled a little bit when people say, well, Black people can be racist too. And I don't think that I think it's maybe defensive when they say that. I'm not sure that they really have felt terribly badly treated, because they've always been in the majority anyway. But it sounds like a situation here where that's very interesting, that people who move into power just kind of naturally fall into wanting to cut others out, I guess. I mean, is that correct? It is a human thing, as you said.
It comes on to the love of power rather than being motivated by the power of love. It's the big difference.
No, that's very good. That's very good. Ray and Bobby, I see you've got your hands up, and I'm going to move on to you. There you go.
That was a good talk, Nathan. Read the book a while back and greatly enjoyed it. Reading it, learned one of the things that there's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of variations. There's ways that there's prejudice and bigotry can be shown that people don't realize what's going on in their own lives. And there's a statement from an article couple of sentences I'd like to read to you and like to get your thoughts on how that fits in. And it says, while equality of opportunity, the absence of discrimination based upon immutable and irrelevant characteristics like race is worth striving for, equality of outcome can never be achieved in our sinful fallen world, humanity, where there are large differences between individuals and families with regard to ability, intellect, and so forth. The vigorous societal pursuit of equality of outcome is utterly inconsistent with and mutually exclusive to any modicum of human freedom, and quickly becomes astonishingly destructive and deadly. Now, to me, that sounds like the thoughts of the SBC back during the Civil War, but maybe I'm misinterpreting it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, and I think that that's a significant. It is a useful reflection, as in that the reality is we don't all start at the same place. In life, in experience, in opportunities, in abilities, and all of those kind of things. And whether I guess some of the work towards equity is to try and level the playing field a little bit. I don't think we're never going to do that perfectly. I don't think I don't expect that we'll solve it, even as we must and should work towards it. Equality of outcome is based on many other factors, as that commenter's pointed out. And I don't know that. I mean, I think that on some basic levels, and I guess when we could use the language of human rights, for example, to say, well, that's the kind of equality of outcome that we should be working towards. But that isn't necessarily, that at the Olympics everybody gets a gold medal, and that's not necessarily the most useful way of doing something, because if you do that, then every gold medal is meaningless, even if it's nice. So I do see that there are basics of human, but I guess from a faith perspective, we should be working more towards equal recognition, equal value, equal opportunity in those kind of ways, and recognizing that there are people still have freedom of choice. I mean, that's a value that we hold, and that people will make better and worse decisions in their lives. But even sometimes those decisions are based on experiences of, the experiences and the opportunities. But the reality is that most of what we see as disadvantage in the world today is not that people make better choices, it's that they have better choices. And that's, I think, a reality that we should be alert to and to be listening to.
But when you throw the words like there's large differences in intellect, that to me suggests a superiority to some point.
Well, if you're tying that to race, I'm not.
Well, it is.
I mean, you've had
the rest of the article was about not being involved in Black Lives Matter, wokeness, and all the rest of the stuff.
Okay. So I don't have that context.
No, I want to delete that out so it wouldn't color your thoughts.
Well, I would step back from that pretty quickly and say, well, that's starting from a place of unhealthy assumptions by the time you get there. Before you even start, you're already categorizing and saying, well, this group of people aren't as clever as this group of people. That's pretty problematic. And the reality is that some people's ways of knowing are discounted. Some people's ways of encountering the world and understanding the world around them are less valued in our world. And so, if I spend some time with an Indigenous person here, on their country here and somewhere in Australia, and they can tell me all sorts of things about the natural world that I would never perceive or understand because of their connection to it. That can be something that I really can respect and admire, but is probably not something that is greatly valued or rewarded in the mainstream of our society. Because how do you put a dollar value on that and some of those ways that we measure things? And so I do think that there's, we need to, I mean, I would reject the assumption behind the statement when you put it in that context.
Well, the Bible and EGW were used to support it. Just as a
last.
Well, that's what a surprise. So thanks, Ray. Appreciate that. I'm gonna go ahead and lower your hand, and I'm going to go to Ed. Ed, your turn.
Hello. I wanted to address the outreach evangelistic efforts of Adventist churches. For example, I live in British Columbia, so there's the Abbotsford, that's near Vancouver, Adventist Church, doing an outreach to the Sikh community, and then we have Native ministries in Canada through the Church of Canada, and they're ministering to Native or Indigenous groups. And then there's I remember Spectrum. Now this is slightly different, but I remember Spectrum wrote an article on 1919 and the rise of Black Adventism, and I don't remember the whole story there, but I don't know if you're familiar with that. But so I just wonder how you view some of these outreaches that target, if you like, specific minorities in society.
Yeah, that's an interesting and sometimes troubling, that can be a new form of colonialism in its own right, or a perpetuation of some of those same kind of attitudes. It's difficult to, not knowing some of the other context to be, if it's simply an extractive process where we're trying to, rescue people from their culture, that can be pretty troubling. If it was people from that culture who are actually engaging in a culturally meaningful way to, share the hope that they've discovered in Jesus, that may well be a good thing. So it's kind of a difficult. I would have some questions to be asked, but I would be interested in wrestling with what actually means with more context and more details. In one of my favorite writing projects a few years ago, I wrote a biography of the first ordained Adventist pastor, Aboriginal person who was ordained as an Adventist pastor here in Australia. And one of the questions that I asked he'd passed away by the time I was asked to write his story. One of the questions that I asked the people that I interviewed, his colleagues and family members, is what was there about his Adventist faith that was different because he came at it as an Indigenous person? What could we learn from his Adventist faith that is shaped by his Aboriginality? And to be honest, I didn't get a good answer to that question, and that troubled me a little bit. And I think that if I was to talk to some of our Indigenous leaders Adventist leaders here in Australia now, there would be better questions to that. So I think that there's work being done to better contextualize and, to better express our faith in more appropriate ways. And I think that should shape our evangelism and shape the ways that we share our faith. And that's something that we need that needs to be an ongoing project for all of us.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you,
Nathan. I wanted to mention Native American. I have several Native American friends. I'm from the upper Midwest of America, and there were some families that I went to school with and have gotten to be friends with. And one of my Native American friends pointed this out to me, which I had never thought of before. And you probably have, but it would apply to Australia as well as the United States. When we interpret Revelation 13, what do we say about the location of what those beasts represent? Well, Europe, they came out of the water because there were people there. In the second beast, it rose up out of the land because there were no people there. There wasn't a population there. And my Native American friend pointed out to me that, as a matter of fact, my people were there. And you in your interpretation, in your official Adventist interpretation of Revelation 13, declared us to not exist. I thought that was really a fascinating insight.
Yeah, that's what I was nodding towards in that comment that I made in my presentation. That's one of the aspects of our prophetic interpretation that is built very directly. That is a perpetuation of the doctrine of discovery. And that has been a question that has been raised, even about the recent NAD state is, well, we can make this statement, but let's take it another step and actually address some of these implications or applications that we've made of it.
No, when you talk about this when the Australian evangelists take this on, how do they handle these? Is Australia considered again part of the second beast, or is the United States of America always the second beast? I'm just curious.
It's always America, and that's one of the things that just leaves me scratching my head, is that we're all up in arms about the traditional thing of, we're up in arms about the prospect of somebody on the other side of the world making laws about having to go to church on Sunday. It's a weird kind of thing that seems to, every time I hear that, I say, well, what about the rest of us? That's I guess a vantage point that I have, from a far country, is simply that, where does the rest of world history and the rest of the world's population fit within this? And I'm sure there are some people that would have answers to or responses to that, but it's
I've not heard a good response. I've not heard a good response. I remember asking an African evangelist one time. I said, you guys have certainly had more experiences. I mean, if the mission stories are to be believed, you've had more experiences of Sabbath persecution, and even if it's just things of being denied to take your tests because it's on a Saturday, or come to graduation because it's a Saturday, or voting because it's on Saturday. I said, do you ever apply the prophecies of Revelation, of those having to do with persecution or oppression, to yourselves? And he said, oh, absolutely not. It only counts if it happens in the United States.
And it was very interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So
actually, one of the only...
You can't have a time of trouble in Africa, even if you're going through one, because it only matters if it happens in the U.S.
That's right.
Pretty fascinating.
I think it was about 15, 20 years ago, there was a coup in Fiji, and the government, and so they actually implemented a Sunday law there, and it almost rated no mention. Kind of odd, and that's the one place that in the world that was actually happening at the time happened to be this idyllic tropical island, or nation, 300 islands to be exact. But anyway, it's and I guess that's one reason. Perhaps there's a little bit more focus on our side of the world about the conspiracies that get about a one world government and some of these kind of things. That perhaps they have a little bit more resonance in this part of the world, because there needs to be something that includes the rest of us. But yeah, we are victims as a church. We are benefited and challenged. We are beneficiaries and victims of the fact that we are a church that grew in America.
That's interesting. We need to, after we talk to Angie, we need to pursue that a little bit more. Angie, would you join the conversation, please?
Sure. I hope you can hear me, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. My thoughts about, I was just comparing what he said already about the people of Israel. Yeah, Israel was a chosen nation. And I think the purpose of Israel being a chosen nation and a blessed people was to show the other nations better ways of life. I think that's the original plan for Israel. Israel, however, has not followed through with that. And through the centuries, we observe Israel becoming more and more like, we are exclusive. We have the blessings of Abraham. We are the chosen people. And they do not try to convert you to be a Jew like them and participate in the blessings. I don't know if you have noticed it. Jews don't try to convert you. They don't try to bring you into their religion. They continue to be the chosen people, the peculiar people, and their uniqueness, they try to keep it for themselves. And perhaps that's one reason Jews are so despised and hated around the world. And we see that right now in our own country. I think it's because people perceive them as, they think they're better than us because they have the blessings, they are the chosen people and all of that. So the Adventists, on the other hand, also think of themselves as the remnant, the church for this time, the blessings are ours. But they invite you to come and join them so you can participate on the blessings now. Now you become one of the remnants as well. So that's what I see the main difference. Now, is it good to be inviting other people to come and join you so they can participate in the blessings and be the remnant as well? Aren't you telling them that they are inferior in some ways because they are not the remnant and we are, and we have the truth, and you need to join us and participate on that truth? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a troubling topic that we've done some reasonably unhealthy things with at different points in our history. I much prefer even the language of talking about the calling to be remnant rather than the claim to be remnant. And that means that we are remnant as much as we live up to that calling rather than that we're imposing that claim upon others. I also see that the calling to be remnant is actually a pretty daunting call. It is a call to self-sacrificing love, and that's actually something that will cost us something, so that we should be pretty careful about claiming remnancy, because that is a commitment to sacrificing our own comfort, our own salvation, even perhaps for the good of others. To me, the Bible's best definition of remnant is when God said to Moses, "Get out of the way, I'm going to destroy destroy the people, and you and your family will become my people. And Moses stepped in and said, God, please don't do that. That won't make you look good. If you've got to destroy somebody, destroy me and my family, but it'll be for God's greater glory to save the larger group. And so if we're truly remnant in that sense, our calling will be to actually seek the salvation and good of others, not ourselves. It's about, defending God's reputation by calling God to treat the world better than it deserves. It's by, sacrificing ourselves for the good of the world. And that's, I think that's what true remnancy is about. And that's why I think that we should be really careful to make those kind of claims, because it will cost us. And if it's not costing us anything, then we're just being arrogant. If it is costing us something, that might be where that somebody else might come to regard us as remnant. But anytime we claim it for ourselves, or even describe ourselves in that way, I think we can talk about and share the calling to be remnant. But to go beyond that is to go beyond being remnant, because the point of remnancy is to point people to God and His goodness, but also perhaps to argue with God and to call out God for the goodness that we aren't seeing in the world around us. And I think that's where the privilege of remnancy is that of arguing with God, and even to saying no to God, to borrow the phrase from Matthew Cortman and his excellent book. So I think that any time we approach remnancy, it should be something that daunts and frightens us, and that we can only go forward into with the courage that God gives us, and at the same time as we are wrestling with God in that reality.
Yeah, what bothers me the most, thank you, Angie. What bothers me the most is this notion, which I hear, if not stated clearly, well, actually, I think it is stated clearly sometimes by the folks in Silver Spring, the sort of corporatizing of the remnant identity. Remnant is the group that is headquartered in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Elder Wilson is in charge of it. And that's how we define the remnant. It is the corporate Seventh Adventist Church. I have a real hard time.
To try and trademark it sometime.
Yeah, well, yeah. They have tried. Even Adventist Today has gotten threatening letters in the past. I would tell you that we ignored them.
Yes.
And we're still Adventist Today. Shelley, would you please? Shelley couldn't figure out how to raise her hand, so we're being kind to her and letting her speak anyway.
I'm just going on the list. I just wanted to say I'm really thankful for these seminars, because I am currently coming live from our hospital parking lot while my husband does rounds. And I'm trying to be HIPAA compliant and aim my phone away from passing ambulances and people, but it's a nice thing to be able to do while I'm waiting on him. I'm especially excited about this topic today. And I kind of wanted to veer it away a little bit and get your thoughts on something that's sort of been bothering me in the last little while here. I think perhaps the ongoing wars and conflicts have heightened it a little bit, but that's more specifically, I think, a tone and an undercurrent of racism that exists within the church and within some of our conversations that we may not be aware of. And so I just wanted to mention that in this context as well. One of the things that I stumbled into when I was doing some family research and I was investigating witch trials, because actually I had some ancestors, unfortunately, associated with that process, was to discover how much and how heavily the Puritan faith pushed back on Native American religion, and vilified it and used it as actively a part of the witch trials that were going on, and that terrible dysfunction of religion within our early nation's history. Mentions were made of, an elderly Indian woman gave these girls some mystical lights, and that was part of the demonic, evidence that they used against them in trial. And so I think in the current culture, one of the things that's been interesting and troubling to me is to hear things like, long ago, an article was written by a then incoming administrator about music and Christian music. And this long discussion about, the rhythms of African music that were coming into our worship services because of, these unhealthy, drums and things. And what is inherently strikes me as being racist about those kinds of concerns and how we convey them in a subconscious way, that we are feeding in on racist tropes in even the discussions of our music. And more recently, I guess my other concern that I just would love to hear your thoughts on is I've been reminded about a tension with anti-Semitism that I think we have, maybe particularly as Adventists, because we retain some of what we would call Old Testament beliefs and fidelity to the Bible, including Sabbath, some of our dietary goals and standards. But we make a distinction that, the Jews believed this, but, we know the full truth. Or a lot in the conversation that we have about Jesus, we kind of randomly throw in these things where we say, well, the Pharisees, they had all these rules and minutia about Sabbath that they observed, and when oddly we have a lot of those rules ourselves, and we just have listened to church leadership describe what is, for lack of a better word, orthodox and not orthodox in terms of what Adventists believe, what is legitimate. So we're pretty persnickety ourselves. And I guess that's one of the things I wonder is, how are we addressing within the church some of the inherent racism that we just kind of habitually fall back into when we're having some of these discussions? The dangers and the corruptions of music, having a racial slant that we bring into it just automatically. Our viewpoint as inheritors in the new Israel and the new remnant is so critical of really the gift we've been given to come into the Judeo-Christian belief as adopted children of that tradition of faith. Anyway, I was just curious if you thought the inherent issues of racism within the church were something that are being addressed, or what steps we could take as we look at that.
Those are really good questions.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah, I think they are important questions for us to be thinking about. And I guess being aware of those as questions is a good place to start. And, we always center the world around ourselves. And, the reality is that, the Adventism that some of us have grown up with in white suburban churches, that's my experience, is not, for a start, it's not majority Adventism. But that's what we, that's the experience we have. And so when we've had opportunities to travel to other places and to to experience other places. But even, it's a real challenge that, the kind of colonial imposition that Adventism has had in so many places around the world. I work for the South Pacific Division, so have opportunities to visit some of our South Pacific nations. And so opportunities like that, and you get there and see, that, I was in Fiji a couple of months ago, and they wouldn't let me preach if I wasn't wearing a tie. And, it's a country that's really hot, and I didn't own a tie, and so they had to provide me one for the purpose. So it's an odd kind of thing that we've, that's not a Fijian tradition. That's the Christian missionaries and the Adventist missionaries, and it's still, and that's a small thing. I wore a tie and I took a photo of myself so that everybody could laugh at me wearing a tie because they'd never seen me do it in 20 years. But that's the kinds of things that we've done, and that, we look at some of, what you've said about music and some of those things. They're real things that we need to work at and to actually work to undo. And, until we can truly celebrate some of the other cultures and other realities, then we will always have a hierarchy of what's good and right and appropriate. And that's a real challenge. And it's in our literature, it's in our, in our explanations, to some degree, it's even in some of our official statements and policies and some of those kind of things. And it's a weird thing that sorry.
No, I was reminded about the importance of speaking out at my son-in-law's graduation, and he attended a master's program at a school where the campus was donated by the local indigenous Native American tribe there, for the sake of educating not only just residents of the area, but their children, specifically their students, and also very friendly and welcoming to minority students as well. And the speaker was one of our Washington State Supreme Court justices who was on the board and helped found this university as well. And, he emphasized the importance of speaking out. And I think that's a tension that is hard within the church, because of course we have these situations where we ask, are we always critical? Are we always nitpicking at the church? But, there's some need, I think, for us to hold ourselves accountable for things, especially that we do unconsciously. I think we can't even have a good conversation about Ellen White without talking a little bit about some of the subconscious things that veer into the lingo that has become anti-Semitism, the rejection of Jesus, and the, that kind of discussion where it's them and us, and that really is part and parcel of what contributed to the deaths of millions of Jews throughout, our Christian history. And so to have that be just a default language within Adventism, to read that in the Spirit of Prophecy writings without addressing it, I just feel like it, again, some more and more of us are going to have to be voices, I think. And I appreciate that, especially about your work and your presentation here today, is that it's yet another voice saying that we need to be more involved, certainly on the, in our culture at large, but also I think that we need to look at these issues within our church, because certainly a church that has inherited so much from the Jewish tradition, being critical of it and thoughtless about how we discuss it is a problem for sure. So I really appreciate your topic today.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I should tell you that there are pictures of Shelley out there trying to dig the basement for the church. She at what, 4 years old?
I was not quite 3, I think.
And there are pictures of her. She was asked to participate in the. I love this story. She was asked to participate in the groundbreaking, and she thought she had to really dig the whole foundations and basement, and was very
I thought we
disappointed
were going to
when
do
they
it all
told her
today that day.
No, you don't get to dig the whole thing.
Yep.
But
biting off more than I can chew.
Nathan, it's true. There have been several evangelical scholars, actually Christian scholars, who have pointed out the odd relationship that Christians have with Jews, because on one hand, we are rather critical of Jews because we assume that the Pharisees, Jesus' scolding of the Pharisees, was sort of a scolding of all Jews, rather than one group of Jews. And yet on the other hand, here in America, supporting the Jews in Israel, Zionism, is extremely important. We hear about it daily. It comes through from right-wing Republican religious leaders and political leaders. Somehow we have to preserve Israel, but it's not because of the Jews themselves. They say that according to Romans, the Jews are going to accept Christ and be saved. It's automatic. It's because by supporting the state of Israel, we are going to push the return of Jesus to come back again. I don't know if you know this whole story, but it's fascinating. And for those of us who live in America, I don't know if this is true over in Australia, but here it is part and parcel of every political discussion almost daily. You can find something about the support of Israel. Mr. Simpson, it is your turn. You had made some good comments in the chat, and I'm glad you joined the discussion.
Hey, yeah, I'm not sure. I joined a little late, but thank you for what I was a part of, and especially some of the quotations. I didn't get a chance to write them all down, but I don't know if it was addressed. Have we defined what racism is? And that was my question in the chat. Because from as being an African American, and I'm just speaking for myself, my experiences, not all of us, but I was taught during high school, college, about doing these social studies or whatever, history, that what racism is a systemic thing. It's not something that where anyone can be a racist. You have to have the power to oppress. You have to have the power to suppress, and you have to have the power to marginalize a particular group of people for your benefit. And so as I'm listening to the conversation, and I don't know, I think I heard someone say, or I read it in the chat, that Black people can be racist too. I don't know. I may be misquoting. I'm not sure, but anyone who is not in power can only be bigoted or prejudiced against another group of people. They cannot be racist, from what my understanding and what my learning has been. So that was my comment. The other thing is, during the times that we're living in and we're seeing all this stuff around, I would like, if possible, to read something, a little short paragraph from A.W. Tozer, and I think we know who that is. It's about our political mindset as Christians, some of us, and as how we view our Christianity in the light of who's politically correct, if I may. And it says, one thing must be kept in mind. We Christians are Christians first and everything else after that. Our first allegiance is to the kingdom of God. Our citizenship is in heaven. We are grateful for political freedom. We thank God for democracy as a way of life. But we never forget that we are sons of God and citizens of another city whose builder and maker is God. For this reason, we must not identify the gospel with any political system or make Christianity to be synonymous with any form of government, however noble. Christ stands alone, above and outside of every ideology devised by man. He does not join in any of our parties or take sides with any of our great men, except as they may come over on his side and try to follow him in righteousness and true holiness. Then he is for them, but only as individuals, never as leaders of some political faction. The true Christian will be loyal to his country and obedient to those in authority, but he will never fall into the error of confusing his own national culture with Christianity. Christianity is bigger than any country, loftier than any civilization, and broader than any human ideology. That's
What
it.
a fantastic quote.
Yes.
That's good.
A.W. Tozer was an amazingly thoughtful evangelical. I really admire him. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate your distinction between prejudice and racism, and that the power dynamic that is a part of it. I think that's significant. I do think that we are all prejudiced in all sorts of ways, but when we start talking about the big picture of racism, that ultimately the real racism that many of us need to be thinking about is that of that of colonization, white supremacy, some of those kind of things, which simply because they are the operating system of our modern world. And that, when we look at slavery, when we look at colonization in all its different expressions around the world, it all comes from that same common understanding and that common source. And so that's what I was seeking to address in the presentation that I made. I do, I understand the call for us to not subject our Christian faith to a political ideology or a particular political project, but I will always insist that the gospel has political implications, and that I think that we as people of God, that should move us towards particular action, particular application of our faith, particularly on behalf of those who are oppressed and those who are disadvantaged and those whose voices are not often listened to. That, I think, is core to what it means to be a follower of God. It's not an accident that God's concern for the poor and the oppressed, a subject of about 2,000 verses throughout the Bible, which is pretty much more than any other topic. That's something that the Bible constantly calls us to. And so that's, we can't ignore that, if we are to be faithful followers of God in the world today. So that's not so much signing up to a particular party or utilizing our faith as a tool. I would put it the other way, that our faith has expressions in the world around us, and politics is one tool that can be used in that way. If it becomes the only tool, then we're out of whack. If it becomes something that comes to dominate, that's completely out of balance. But politics is one of the ways that some of the things in our world get done, and that's why we can't ignore it in that context.
Before Vince is next in line, but let me ask you a rather blunt question. Nathan, as you look at your home field of Australia and the Aboriginal people who live there, and at this point, if I'm not mistaken, a good number of people from the islands and Asian nations are also part of the Adventist community there.
Yeah.
How would you evaluate how honestly and carefully your leaders in Australia have been managed to deal with the issue of race and cultural differences?
Not very well. I would say that we kind of have this assumption that everything's fine and we all love each other and everything's good. And that's our I think that's the operating assumption from many of our church leaders, and they would prefer not to have anything that upsets that assumption, because that makes their life more complicated. These are difficult topics. Socially, they're difficult topics. Politically, they're difficult topics within the church. And I think that,
is there good,
we kind of,
is there acceptance, more or less, if you have somebody from a different culture rather than the white Australian culture, European culture? Do they make it into leadership? Are they comfortable preaching and pastoring church that is majority European ancestry? How are they dealing with that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that happen. I mean, that does happen. So I think that I think that the dynamics of race are a little bit different in Australia than compared to the US. One of them is that we are not so alert to it, I think, whereas a well-intentioned group or organization in the US is much more focused on representation than sometimes we are in Australia. I think that one of the things is that while we don't have dominant racial groups or recognizable ethnic groups that are as large in Australia. For example, our Indigenous people are 3% or 3 to 4% of the Australian population. So they simply, many people don't know an Indigenous person. And particularly where I live in the south, near Melbourne, you can not know that you encounter Indigenous people in your day-to-day life. So in some of those kind of ways, it's not quite. There are some communities that are quite homogenous in that way. So while there are parallels here between the Black population in the United States, for us, that what is considered the main Black or coloured population here is the Indigenous peoples, and they're only 3 to 4%. Now, we have issues such as the incarceration rates amongst our Indigenous peoples are actually the highest in the world per capita. That's a significant thing that we really should, but it's still a relatively small number because of the minority status within the population. But it also means that they don't have that kind of political clout, that there is not the mass voices that can be, without there being others that will pay attention to the cause. And I would say that most of
I know that you also have quite a few Asian people. Melody Tan is a friend of mine. You know Melody, and she has made a real impact with her writing and editing and podcasting there. So you must have come to some sort of comfortable place with working with the fruit salad the salad of people that you have there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey, Vince,
yeah.
would you go ahead, finish up, then I'll.
Australia is a Australia is a multicultural nation, and many people would argue successfully so. Um, but it also tends to downplay difference, and you'll get along as long as you assimilate, basically, and that's nothing against those who do. It's simply a reflection that you've got to fit a certain mold, and then it works for you. And if you're outside that mold, then you will be largely unseen because you will be a very small minority.
That's so interesting. I've always wanted to visit there and get a feeling for it, because it strikes me as a very interesting culture. The way you function. Vince, join this conversation.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Vince.
Okay. Just a few comments, and I'd like to get your impressions of what I say or so forth. But like reading this week about the vision that Peter, I believe it was, had of the unclean animals, and he was told to kill and eat. And of course, the meaning behind that was to start going to the Samaritans and the Gentiles away from the Jewish people. Jesus, of course, the woman in the Samaritan well says to him, how is it that you talk to me, a female and a Samaritan? And so Jesus is telling her, no, you're important and so forth. It seems to me that the New Testament basically tears down the structure that was set up purposely in the Old Testament, where they were to be a chosen, purebred nation, no intermarriage, and all those things. And then if you want to be a little cynical about it, it was known that this would all fail, because the very first, you'll bruise the head, you'll bruise your heel, or all the other prophecies that the lamb would be slain and so forth. But it seems like racism was purposely used by God for some reason in the Old Testament, torn down in the New Testament. It seems a little bit cynical in a way, given what we've been talking about today. Just your reaction to that.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. There are far smarter people than I that work on explaining some of the apparent outrages of the Old Testament and some of the prejudices and some of those kind of things that some of us would bristle against and really find troubling. I think that so there are different ways that we can, whether this was divinely inspired, whether this was a way that the people explained their history and their story, and all sorts of various permutations in between. So I do struggle with those who would take some of these things in the Old Testament as models for how we should live. I think that's really troubling, because there's a lot of things in the Old Testament that certainly aren't how I would choose to live, or that I think are the best or God's intention for who we are to be. But when it comes to that idea of chosenness, and we've sort of talked about that a little bit in the context of our own discussions of remnancy and some of those things. I think that we need to sort of. I do think that the New Testament certainly did broaden it out, and you mentioned Peter's vision, and even I think part of the problem is that we center ourselves in the story a little bit too much, and to me, when I read the Great Commission, for example, it says this go and go therefore and make disciples of all nations, and we often take this as our marching orders. This is who we are to go forth and conquer the world. I think the best way for us to read that is that we are actually first recipients. We're at the end of that long chain of transmission that story has come to us by. We are the people that are actually the people that were the focus of it. That in a land so far from that hilltop in Galilee where Jesus and the disciples were sitting and looking across the lake, when we sort of get to the end of that process and recognize that far more generations than they could have imagined in a language that didn't exist yet, after all these generations have told the story and retold the story and have come down to us, then we are the people that are the all nations. The absolute, when it talks about I'll be with you to the ends of the earth, this is us. We are the people at the ends of the earth, whether that's time or geography or language or whatever that might be. And so instead of us being the center of the story that are firstly the disciples that are called to go forth, we are actually the people that are beneficiaries of this right at the end of that process. Certainly as far as that process has gone along until today. And so we are not the center of the story. We're the extreme fringes of that story. And we get to benefit from it. And we get to then be invited into that story. That should be a place where we start as extreme humility of how incredible it is that this story has been told and retold and passed down over generations and across languages and across oceans and continents and all of those things. And we, in this Jesus story, are people that kind of just turn up at the last minute. So that we are never the center of the story. We're always the people that are simply, invited into us. We're the people at the end of the day who somehow get paid for a full day's work after turning up at 10 to 6 in the evening. And so I think kind of to situate ourselves historically, and we often talk about that personally and grace and all those things. They are all important and valuable parts of our faith, but to situate ourselves historically is so far removed from that story of Jesus and the disciples sitting on the hilltop that they could have never imagined us. That we are actually the marginalized and the dispossessed who are finally at the last minute invited into the story. And then we get there and look around and go, wow, God loves all these other people too. Isn't that incredible? And that we live because of this with this complete attitude of, that our first starting point is always one of incredible humility. And that should be our posture towards the world and our faith.
Thank you. Well, this is Randy. My name's Randy Robertson. I'm gonna host us to the end because Lauren is off to an engagement. So I was gonna ask a question that you just ran down the rabbit hole. I was gonna take host privileges, but you ran right down the rabbit hole of where my question goes. So I won't ask it. George, if you would unmute, join the conversation.
Yes, I guess I am unmuted now, isn't it?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Yes. Thank you for this great presentation and for being involved in a project like this through your research and teachings. What comes to my mind in this discussion today is simple. It's cognitive dissonance, because I don't know how to reconcile two things. One is the desire to eliminate discrimination with its branches like racism and etc. And with what the church teaches actually to its members, to new converts. Discrimination is part of the literature. the Adventist literature is full of encouragement for discrimination. For example, women's ordination. The church is fighting not to stop the discrimination, gender discrimination, let alone religious discrimination. I went to 16 years of schooling in an Adventist educational institution. It's the Brazilian College in São Paulo. The old Brazilian College now is a biggest university in Adventist in university in the world. Well, I was brainwashed since age 6 against the Catholics and other religions. This is blatant discrimination. This is something that is taught in the schools, comes with the remnancy, lunacy, comes along with that. What are your thoughts about if we want to sanitize the Adventist message, how to do it? If we want to sanitize it from taking discrimination out, if this is so into it, so inserted in it, and actually the spirit of now there go 1 billion books that incite discrimination. What are your thoughts about this? Thank you.
I don't think you're going to get to much argument from me on this. I think that we have a lot of work to do. Maury Jackson's chapter in the book talks about sort of our challenge with denominationalism and some of the prejudice that is involved with that, and the analogy to racism and even the overlaps in that kind of thinking. Our calling is to be better than to be a denomination. And that shouldn't be that should be a humility, a recognition of humility, not a calling to arrogance. And I think that we should be some of the things that you've talked about, and that there is work to be done there. There is this, I started with that quote from Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and her her linking between discrimination based on gender and discrimination based on race, and that they are of the same kind of evil. And I think that's a real challenge, something that we should be, that we're fallen short of. And of course, one of the things is, and I quoted from Fundamental Belief 14, which talks about how we're all equal. But the reality in the church is that our policy trumps our doctrine in that sense. And so we're all equal, except where our church policy says we aren't. And of course, that's particularly focusing on the issue of women's ordination. We are certainly not, when we address some of these issues, we are not coming from a place of purity or perfection. So we need to step into this with humility, to recognize the log in our own eyes as much as the speck in others, and to recognize that both of those things are problems, because they cloud both our seeing, both our visions.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a beautiful reflection, Nathan. Dr. Johnston, if you would please unmute.
Thank you. I think the discussion has been a little bit muddied by the careless conflation of race and culture, as if they were synonyms, as if nature and nurture were synonyms. There are two different things. Belgians and Turks are all Caucasians, but they have quite different cultures. Ted Cruz and Texas rednecks have different genealogies, but they share the same culture. Even though we take it as axiomatic that all races are created equal, does it necessarily follow that all cultures are equal? Is the culture of the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea equal to that of New South Wales? Is there no reason to try to change a culture that practices honor killing or female circumcision or purdah or some other things that we could mention? I'd like to hear a little more clarity about this particular issue. Does the acceptance of all races mean the uncritical acceptance of all cultures?
No, and I think you make a good point. I think that there are reasons why we disagree with people, and why we have different perspectives, and why we would even seek to share our faith in ways that would uplift others. And of course, that's coming from our culturally conditioned perspective as well. There are reasons why we choose to live in a certain way. Some of them are, as you said, nurture. Some of them are actual intentional decisions that we make from time to time. Your point between, of making the distinction between race and culture is valid to a degree, to the degree that it is valid. To the degree where it simply, where the things are, where those two terms are actually used synonymously, and that we reject a certain thing because of where it comes from or because of the people that might practice that, that's where they do overlap, and where we need to be discerning as far as how we're making those distinctions and why. So I think that's, you make an important point. But as the comment that's just popped up is just made, that all cultures have their blind spots and have their failings, and to assume that what we might consider Western culture is necessarily superior in most or all or whatever, however you might want to call it, in all aspects, is not, that's something that we need to approach with humility and discernment about as well. So that's we're getting into some really complicated territory when we start, but necessarily complicated. And I appreciate you raising this point. But I do think that we need, I think perhaps even as people of God, we are actually called to be more, we have, because of the assurance that we can have in our faith, we can actually step into some of these other spaces with less fear, with less judgmentalism, with less, prejudice in some of those ways than other people who might be more threatened by that, because of our identity and our understanding of a God who has created all people in his image, a God who is, seeking to reach all people in and through their cultures, as well as through the interactions that we might have with them. God is already at work in places before we get there. And that's something that we are called to recognize, and that is an opportunity that we have as people who claim to know and follow that God who is creator of all.
Fascinating, that Dr. Johnston brought up the idea of female circumcision. We have history within our own tradition that really harkens to some of those things early in our tradition, granted, but cultures evolve to include Western culture, and I think you speak to it well, but I think we sometimes have to be, it's easy to throw stones, maybe. So, all right, Lynn, if you'll unmute, join in.
I'm really glad that Dr. Johnson brought up that point. That was one of the main issues that I was going to speak to. You know, we should be discriminating between good and bad, between better and best, and that's important for us, I think, as a community. But this presentation that Nathan has given us was entitled Racism. And we didn't actually define that very well, and that worries me a bit. I've thought about it quite a bit, and I've had quite a bit of experience in racial differences and cultural differences. And there is some crossover, but conflating the two is not a good thing. But any distinction that we make based on physical characteristics, to me, is a bogus distinction. I posted a reference to that earlier in the chat. There's a fairly famous case in South Africa where a girl was born to white parents who didn't look the right color, and they did some tests on her and decided that even though she had the clean inheritance, she must not be, because of her physical characteristics. And so they pretty much kicked her out of all the schools that she was in, and she was alienated from her family. And I finally came to the conclusion that if you can't tell exactly when a person becomes white or colored or black in their heritage, then the word race based on physical characteristics is just meaningless. Nobody can define it physically. Now we can now with DNA, I suppose, in terms of percentages, a little bit more. But I just throw that one out the window. Race is just bogus completely in terms of physical characteristics. On the other hand, our discussion has developed rather into discrimination and unfair discrimination, and that's a different subject. It's not really what most people think of when they think of racism. And I thought, Nathan, that you said once, just not long ago, that we had denominationalism. Is that what you said, or was it denominationalism?
I don't know if you're.
At any rate, I think it was denominationalism is more accurate in many cases, where we have a nationalism of sort where we draw lines between ourselves and others on fairly unimportant things. We do this discrimination, which I said was important, and I still believe that, but on fairly unimportant things. There was some discussion about some of the instances of cultural exportation in our church history, and it still goes on, and also in our interpretation of prophecy, which still goes on. This is a form of nationalism. It's a form of discriminating against, like Dr. Zeus had the sneetches with stars on theirs, and those that didn't. I don't know if any of you have read that book, but it's just silly in many cases. However, I do respect cultural differences, and the cultural differences are important, because the other cultures perceive the world differently, and in many ways, I found more profoundly or accurately than what I grew up with. And I have to find some criteria to judge what is good, what is not so good, and what is best. And I think that's what we're struggling with. I'll close with this short story. When I was still a student, undergraduate student at Walla Walla College, what used to be Walla Walla College, one of my professors, theology professors, was a good friend of mine. I won't say his name because I don't have permission to do that, but he's still around. I asked him, what is the one area of theology that Seventh-day Adventists could do more work in? And he said, yeah, I think it's the doctrine of the church. And I think the more we talk about this, and the more I get on with my personal experience, I believe that's true. It's a doctrine. I reinterpret that or rephrase that as a doctrine of our community. And our community needs to have some lines that we do not cross, that we do not accept. And I don't think we've really been able to think about that very clearly yet. I appreciate this group pushing some of those discussions, at least for me. And I do believe that this denominationalism might be a problem for us. I'll stop there.
I appreciate the comments that you've made and some of the points that you've drawn out, to where I think that there is some in the introduction to A House on Fire. Maury and I spent quite a bit of time trying to define racism in more specific terms, and that's it's a contested issue in itself. But I think what we can recognize is that while there is not a biological basis for race, and you've tried to push back on to say, well, the whole thing is bogus in that sense, what I would point you to is that that is not the experience of people who there is the sociological experience of race, and those people.
Look, can I respond to that? We know, for example, I teach marketing. People like to be with people who are like themselves, and that is not just in culture. That is also in appearance, in habit, etc. I understand that, and the practical outworking of that is that we tend to group ourselves. That's the way we are. We separate ourselves to those groups that we feel most comfortable with. And in fact, in economics, we can reach them in marketing depending on the target markets and those characteristics that we can separate those groups in and actually reach them in a more economical way. That's really important. We know that that's true. So in practical terms, I believe the church has to realize that and deal with it in a helpful way, rather than a way that might destroy or downgrade somebody's values or experience that are not really relevant. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I would then push back against your comment that they're not really relevant, because they are not just affinity groups. They're not just, there are sociological phenomenon that you can observe. In Australia, for example, our Indigenous people, on the whole, on average, live 8 years less, have a 8 year shorter life expectancy than mainstream Australia. And
don't get me wrong. That's relevant. But wearing a tie,
so
you mentioned it yourself. You had to wear a tie to be accepted. Okay.
Well, I'm talking about
do people having to wear dresses instead of pants to church. People, those we have exported a Western, I'd say an American Christianity to many places, and it survives. I mean, the people that I dealt with were rigidly following those things as if it were the gospel. That's what I'm talking about. The things that you talk about, I agree. There are some things that do make a difference. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, and even the tie to me is a very trivial example of a much larger cultural imperialism that we've that has often come with our missionary work. One of my colleagues here recently, did some work on her own culture in in Samoan culture, and how Christianity has actually diminished the status of women in that culture compared to the place that they held in traditional culture, and a certain version of Christianity. And so, when we're starting to talk about cultural colonialism, I think we're a step away from. It's not disconnected, but we're a step away from, as we've talked about, the distinction between culture and race. But I mean, and it has been boasted about in Adventist circles as this idea that you can go to any church, any Adventist church around the world, and it'll feel familiar. That's been a boast that we've kind of made as a church at times. And that's the fact that we don't see that as a little bit odd, or even something worse, should cause us to ask some questions. Why do we think it's strange? Why don't we think it's strange that your basic worship service is the same everywhere in the world, when we're trying to reach people of multiplicity of cultures and languages and all of those things? So that's, to me, is an interesting again, just an interesting trait within our Adventist culture. So that's we've gone with this idea of to a degree of a homogenous Adventist culture that we claim transcends some of these things, but at the same time, and getting back to the example of the Sabbath School quarterlies that all emanate from one particular cultural perspective, or overwhelmingly. Why aren't we more concerned about that?
Yeah, fascinating. Now, I want to say thanks. We're out of time. We're to our closing time. I want to say thank you, sincerely thank you to everybody who participated in the conversation. But Nathan, for taking on honestly a difficult topic.
Indeed.
But it's such a timely topic, and I expect we could spend many more hours with this conversation, and maybe we can take it up again in the future. But thank you, everyone. As we close, I'm not sure what's for next week, but we'll be meeting again next week. I'm sure there's going to be another fascinating conversation, and let us pray to God for his blessing as we leave. So God, our creator and our redeemer, we want to thank you for this opportunity to come together and talk about hard topics, even when it may not be real comfortable. May we do it in grace, may we do it in love, and may we grow through the conversation. Bring us back together again to converse and to grow. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.